Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Dr. Judith Danovitch is a professor of psychological and brain sciences at the University of Louisville, where she directs Knowledge and Development, KID Lab. Dr. Danovitch earned her PhD in psychology from Yale University in 2005. Her research focuses on how preschool and elementary school children think about knowledge and expertise, and how they evaluate different types of information sources, including people and the internet. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Templeton Foundation. She's published over 50 articles in scientific journals and has written about child development for the New York Times. She aims to translate this research, what it says, into practical advice that caregivers and educators can use. If you please would help me welcome Dr. Judith Danovitch.
Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here tonight. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the research says about kids and technology and some of the research that we do in my lab at U of L. But I will leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. So just hopefully we can have plenty of that. So today I'm going to be talking about what it's like to raise children or to care for children in the modern world, in the digital age. I'll preface this by saying I'm a parent of a 14-year-old, so this is also things that we deal with in my house a lot on a regular basis. So I want to start with just some general statistics. I like numbers and data. So as of right now, over 68% of the population of the world has access to the internet in some form, and presumably that number is going up every second. And for our purposes, one of the things that I'm interested in is what about children? So the data around the world is a little more sparse for children, but in the U.S., we know that at least 98% of children have internet access in their home. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it. And this is data from 2017, so that number, again, has probably gone up, if anything, especially since COVID. And just to kind of get a sense of what some of the issues are, last year, a survey of American teenagers found that 46% of them said that they are on the internet almost constantly, right? They were given choices of different amounts of time, and they said basically all the time. I'm always on there, often on phones. So those are the numbers, but I also like to try to get a picture of what does this really mean for people's lives? And one thing that this means is that many children, literally from the moment they're born, are being exposed to technology and devices that can access the internet. They might not be accessing it themselves, but they're seeing the people around them use these devices. These technologies are also growing increasingly interactive and sophisticated. So the relatively recent introduction of voice assistants, right, devices like Alexa, Google Home, that you talk to, right, and they respond, has really kind of changed the landscape, because now even pretty young children who don't know how to read and write yet can access the internet to some extent, right? They can ask questions. And in fact, if you go on YouTube, you will find lots of videos of 2- and 3-year-olds talking to these devices. So that's a pretty recent change to the landscape, because, it used to be that you basically had to be able to type a little or read a little bit to kind of get online and do things, but not anymore. And as children get older, I'm sure many of you have observed this in our environment, they are spending a lot of time on tablets, on smartphones. A lot of children have their own devices. And again, because this is all really quite new, right? This hasn't been around that long. We still don't really know what are the effects of this, right? What are the effects of having this exposure from birth? What are the effects of using these technologies? There's been a lot of concerns raised about this. This is just an example of a couple of headlines that I found, right? So people have asked, is this harmful? Is this damaging kids? Is it causing them to turn into, zombies that are, only looking at their screen all day long? There's also been quite a few books on this topic. I just want to highlight two of them that have had a big impact. So one is called The Shallows. It was published in 2010 by Nicholas Carr. And it's not particularly about children. In fact, it's really focused on adults. And what Carr is talking about in this book, The Shallows, the title kind of even implies this, is questioning what kinds of effects the internet might be having on people's thinking. So for example, is this affecting people's memory? Is this affecting people's motivation? So some people have said, for example, now that we have access to Google, do we really need to remember as many things, right? It's so easy to look things up. Maybe we don't need to remember all the state capitals anymore. It takes 2 seconds, right, to type it into your phone and look it up. And psychologists and others have wondered, is this going to have long-term effects on how people think, on our memories, on our, there's some research also looking at motivation to answer questions where, again, this is with adults. Adults are somewhat less motivated. If you give an adult a tough trivia question and they have access to the internet, you're a little more hesitant to try to answer it on your own, right? Because you might think, oh, well, I'll just look it up. That way I'll know for sure. I won't try to answer it. So again, this book came out in 2010 and started, I think, really kicking off this conversation. Much more recently, there's this book. How many of you have seen it or read it? I know it's very popular right now. This book is called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. It's currently, I just looked a few days ago, it's number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's been on there most of this year. They just put it on their list of notable books for 2024. So Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist. I, in fact, met him many years ago. And what he proposes in this book is that this access to technology, and particularly smartphones and social media, that's really one of the things that he focuses on in his book, is leading to negative effects on children's and especially teens' mental health. So a lot of the book really focuses on that social media piece, like being online, comparing yourself to others, different kinds of activities that kids are doing on social media. And again, he's proposing that this is leading to mental health problems for the kids who use it. He also talks quite a bit, I want to note, about other things that have happened in the last decade or so in terms of how much freedom children have, how much independence, how much time they spend, in school doing academic work, and how that may also be contributing. And I think he has some good points there. I'm also mentioning this because I'm not going to focus today on social media. Social media would be its own hour-and-a-half long session, and if that's something you all really want, I could maybe do that in the future, but it's not really my area of expertise either. I do my research more on children, and that's really more about adolescents or older kids. So again, I wanted to point out these books, as other potential reading also if you want to read more about these topics. But one of the things I also like to point out is that being worried about technology is not actually a new thing. And previous generations have also had these concerns. So here's a quote from a pediatrician, a prominent pediatrician, Dr. John Anderson. And he said, one of the greatest controversies of our time revolves about the good or harmful effects of this device upon children. What device do you think he was talking about? I heard a lot of TV. Anyone? So this was back in 1939. He was talking about the radio. And he has a whole essay, and now it's kind of funny to read, right? Because now nobody would worry about a child listening to the radio. But yeah, back in 1939, that was the new technology, and he had, and it's funny because you read it, and Many of his concerns are, I think, the same concerns you might say today. Kids are spending too much time on this. They're not going outside and playing because they're waiting for their favorite radio show to come on. And so, I think it's important to have that context, right? Every new technology brings concerns, especially about children. And, we don't always know yet what will the effects be of the radio or TV or, the internet on kids. So I want to highlight what are some of these concerns right now, particularly about children and technology. And these are the concerns that John Haidt brings up in that book, The Anxious Generation. So one is that we have seen since around 2010, 2012, an increase in anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues, particularly among teens. And that happens to also be the time frame where smartphones became widely available, right? So you could take it with you wherever you go. Social media became a great deal more popular, right? Things like Instagram and TikTok have really exploded in the last 10 to 15 years. I will point out that there are critics of this. Really, it's a hypothesis, right? This idea that social media and smartphones are causing these effects. So other people have pointed out, other psychologists have pointed out, that there's also been other issues that have changed since then. So one is parents also feel a lot more stress. Families just in general feel a lot of stress. But also we are becoming more sensitive to asking children about their mental health and screening them and detecting mental health issues, right? So it's tricky to say, is this causing this or is this the only cause? But the fact is that there has been this increase, and some people have linked it to social media in particular. Another one is attention and memory. So like I said, there's concerns that having access to the internet might make us less motivated to learn things, and less motivated to remember things. Attention can be really disrupted by technologies. We've all probably had this experience, right? Things pop up and interrupt you, and this kind of prolonged attention that we think is important for being able to do things like, read a difficult book, that could be affected by exposure to technology and getting used to that. Another big concern, particularly with kids, has to do with sleep and whether using technology is leading to sleep deprivation, which we know can have a lot of other negative effects, including anxiety and depression and all those mental health issues, right? So that's another thing that we think might be happening. There's some research to suggest that, looking at screens, especially right before you go to bed, like the blue light and things like that, could be harming kids' sleep. Also, kids just stay up really late doing these activities on technology. And finally, there is a concern about the potential for this to become addictive, to actually, there are a small percentage of adults and sometimes children who really become, truly addicted, like they cannot let go of this, right? It's very disruptive for their lives. Again, the percentage of people who seem to experience that is quite small relative to the number of people using it, but it's still something to be worried about. So let me tell you what I'm going to talk about this evening. So this is the roadmap. I like to tell people kind of where we are and where we're going when I speak to audiences. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is to tell you just a little bit more about, what kids are actually doing online. What are they doing with technology? And I'm going to tell you some of the research we've done in my lab looking at what kids think about technology. Then we're going to get into some more practical advice. So one thing I'm going to focus on is what kinds of things make technology-based activities educational? What can you look for if you want the purpose to be learning? Sometimes we don't want that to be the purpose, and that's okay. But when you do, there's certain things that you can look for. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what caregivers can do to help kids develop healthy technology habits and what kinds of things they should look for. All right. So we're going to start by talking about what kids are doing online these days. And some of these graphs are information from the Pew Research Center. They have a great website, and they do national surveys, sometimes of kids, sometimes of parents. And so these data actually come from a survey they did in March of 2020. They just happened to do it right before everything shut down for COVID. So, we have to kind of keep in mind that probably all these numbers are higher after COVID than they were in March of 2020, just coincidentally. So in this survey, parents were asked, what kinds of devices does your child use? These were parents of children in the U.S. Who had a child under age 11. And as you can see, there's a lot of TV, phones, computers, not so much gaming devices, and this is broken down by age group. So you can also see that as the kids get older, the parents are saying, okay, they're using more of a range of devices. When it comes to social media, right, because that's one of the big concerns. The good news is really young kids aren't really using social media. That's what you kind of see here, right? So again, these very small numbers are because, there's not a lot of 3-year-olds on Snapchat and Instagram, which is a good thing. You start to see kids picking up social media around this 9 to 11 age range, and then, really picks up into like teen years. And so again, that's another reason why I'm not really focusing on social media today, because that's really not a big issue for younger children. So what are the younger children doing? One of the things they're doing is they're watching a lot of YouTube. Like that, in many of these different surveys, turns out to be one of the big things, right? In this one, 80% of the parents said their kid watches YouTube videos. And so they dug a little deeper there and asked them, okay, well, what do you think they're doing on YouTube? Like, what are they getting out of it? And so what you see here is they were asked, which of these things do you think they get out of YouTube? And so a lot of parents, 97% of them said, it keeps my child entertained, right? They're watching things that are entertaining. But 88% of parents also said that often or sometimes YouTube helped their child learn new things. And a little bit less of a number, but still quite a few parents said it also exposed them to new ideas like different cultures. So parents are seeing this as, it's fun and entertaining and the kids like it, but there is also some potential educational value to YouTube, and I would argue for other kinds of technology as well, right? It's not all just garbage that they're finding online, right? Some of it can teach you some new things. And in fact, I've seen my child do this, right? There's videos, for example, that teach you how to draw things. He did a lot of those for a while, right? So, there are some nice skills you can learn from watching YouTube videos. So I'm going to tell you a little bit then, one of the things that's missing from these surveys is they rarely ask the kids, what can these technologies do? Like, what do you think you can use this for? And so that's a thing that I'm very interested in, is knowing, how do kids view these technologies? So I'm going to tell you a little about the research that we do in my lab at U of L. And so one of the studies that we've done is just asking kids, what do you think the internet is good for? Like, what kinds of information can you access? And before I tell you about it, I want to acknowledge that a lot of this work was done by Lauren Gerard-Hallam, who graduated from our doctoral program this year, back in May. She was my graduate student, and we worked together on a lot of these projects. And she's now at the University of Michigan studying children and AI. So she'll be doing some cool new things soon. So for this first study that I'm going to tell you about, we asked 800 children, which is a lot for us. We don't usually have such big numbers. The children, some of them were here in Louisville, some of them we talked to online, and then some of them were actually in China. This was also with my collaborators in China we were looking at cross-culturally. And we gave them just a pretty short survey. I'm not going to read you all the questions. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. So one thing is we asked them, what kinds of information do you think the internet can give you? And the way this survey works is, if you agree with the statement a lot, you pick the big yes. And if you don't, you pick the big no, and you can pick, anything in between, right? Because you have to make these surveys so that kids can understand them. Oh, and I should have mentioned these kids were ages 6 to 10. So one kind of question, one category, we just had statements like, the internet can give you information about things that are happening in the world right now. How much do you agree with that? The internet can give you information about things that happened a long time ago. We also had ones about things like science information. And adults would generally say, yeah, right, the internet can give you a lot of information about the world, history, things like that. Then we started getting at how accurate the information is. So these statements were things like, most of the information on the internet is true. So again, the kids had to decide how much did they agree with that statement. And then finally, we asked them about the internet as an information source. These are two of my favorite questions. So we asked them, the statement was, there's more information on the internet than any library on earth. How many of you all would agree with that? Yeah, I mean, the internet does have, literally it has a lot of information. And then this one was more of an opinion. So the kids were asked, the statement is, I would rather use books than the internet to find information. So again, they could pick whatever they felt was true for them. So here's what we found when we did this. So I'm going to show you the results like visually, and I'll also tell you. So when we asked kids about what kinds of, how much information is available, they, on average, said yes, right? So these red dots actually represent the average scores when we turn these into numbers. So kids are saying, yeah, the internet can give you information about things happening in the world right now, things that happened in the past. They also, for the most part, felt that the information on the internet is true. Again, we could debate that, I think, all night, how much of it is true. But that's how they saw it. And then these, I really like their responses here. So when they were asked, the statement was, there's more information on the internet than any library on earth, the majority of kids said no. So yes, our library staff should be very happy to see this. And you'll like this even better. When asked, the statement is, I would rather use books than the internet to find information. Most kids said yes. They actually said they preferred books. So I think, one of the takeaways here, right, is that it's not all bad news. For one, kids are kind of aware, right? They're not saying absolute yes to everything is true online. And these are young kids. They see the internet as an information source. That said, they don't fully understand its capacity, right? They're not really fully understanding, a lot of times the internet can give you information that's not in a book. And in other research, not in my lab, we also know that they don't really understand how the internet works. By the way, a lot of adults don't understand how the internet works either. But they still kind of sometimes think there's a tiny person in there, things like that. Young kids sometimes think that. So another question we've asked in our research, kind of following up on some of this, is what kinds of questions do kids think the internet can answer? And in this study, we asked them specifically about Google. We find in our research that even 4- and 5-year-olds, for the most part, are familiar with Google. They have heard of it. They've seen people using it. So they know it's out there, even if they haven't necessarily used it themselves, right? They've seen adults using it. And so here we, again, try to dive in a little bit more to what kinds of things do you think Google can tell you about the world? So here we had questions about things that happened in the past. So we had these scenarios, which I'll show you in a second, where we say things like, Susie wants to know what the weather was like yesterday. All right, that's something I think most people would agree. Google can probably tell you that. One of the things that the internet is particularly good for is giving you information in real time, right? If you want to know what's the weather right now, what's the score of the big game that's going on, right? You don't open a book, you go on the internet, right? That's one of the things it's really useful for. So we had questions about the present. And then we also wanted to see kind of how far do they think Google can go? So can Google tell you about things that will happen in the future? And in this study, it was just tomorrow. We've done other studies now where it's longer term future. So Jill wants to know what the traffic will be like on the road tomorrow. Can Google tell her that? And I just want to give you a sense of how we do this research. So typically we sit with the children one-on-one. Sometimes we're doing this on a Zoom call, sometimes in person. We show them pictures because they're young kids, and we kind of explain everything to them. So the way this study worked is we might say, this person in the middle here is Susie. Susie wants to know what the weather is like today. Can her friend Ellen tell her, answer her question correctly? Can Google answer her question correctly? And then we'll say things like, okay, so if they say yes to both, which one do you think would be better? We also ask kids to explain it. Why would you think Google would know more about what the weather will be? tomorrow. So this is some graphs. Don't worry too much about them. I wanted to just kind of show you the data. So when we asked kids about yesterday, the orange part up here, that's kids saying yes to Google. And this is the blue line is kids saying yes to the friend, the human being. And so you can see all the kids at all ages said, Google is really good at telling you about things that happened yesterday. And it didn't really matter how old they were. When we ask them about things happening right now, things happening today, what you see is this line kind of goes up with age, meaning that the older the kids are, the more they're starting to realize, oh yeah, Google is really good at that. And in fact, my friend might not be as good at that, right? Because people don't always have that information. And then when we ask them about, okay, can it tell you about what's going to happen tomorrow? Again, you see this increasing trend, but you'll notice this line is a lot lower. So a lot of kids are saying no. There's a limit to what Google can do. And of course, there's a lot of limits to what people can do in terms of predicting what's going to happen the next day. When we ask kids then to tell us, okay, well, why do you think this can do it? What we do is we take their answers and we code them into different categories. We have students who sit there and read through them and type them out. And so here's just examples of the kinds of things kids said. So kids sometimes talked about access, like Google is hooked up to the internet, so it can see what the traffic is. Sometimes they just talk about knowledge. They'll say things like, Google knows about everything. By the way, we have other studies asking if they think Google or technology can be omniscient, can literally know everything. Sometimes they say the person's better, and they'll say things like, well, Beth, the person, can go to the beach and count how many people, so that's something Google can't do, right? Sometimes there are things that technology cannot answer. And then they sometimes also talk about things like accuracy, right? Google's more accurate, or efficient. Google would get you the answer faster than your friend would. So again, when kids chose Google, when they said Google could do this better than a person, they often talked about information access. They talked about knowledge. They more rarely talked about things like it's fast and efficient and accurate. And sometimes they said, well, I would pick Google because the person can't answer this question. So it's not really that Google's so great. When they chose the person, the majority of the time they said it's because a person can see things, a person can hear things, a person can experience whatever is happening and tell you about it. Though sometimes sometimes they were saying, well, the person because Google doesn't know it. What we found in this research is as they get older, kids are actually increasingly seeing Google as a useful tool for getting answers to questions, right? The younger kids are kind of less sure about what kinds of questions can Google answer. So now all that research was with children ages 6 to 10, because remember, to use these things, you have to have at least a little bit of reading knowledge usually to be kind of familiar with them. But I'm also very interested in what happens with even younger kids, because again, they're using these things, they're seeing people use them. So what do they make of it? So we've also done a kind of another version of this with voice assistants. Kids, a lot of homes now have these voice assistants, devices like Alexa, Google Home, Siri. And when parents are asked, what is your child doing with these? Number one answer is actually playing music, which they're actually really good for. We have one at my house primarily for that purpose, right? You can listen to any song you want. The child can ask for it. But the second most common answer was that they're getting information. They're asking it questions that they want to know the answer to, and they want to know what it says. And so an important thing for us then as adults is to know, do they trust it? Like, do they think the answers are correct that they get from these devices? And so we did a study to try that, to see if we could understand that better. So in this study, we didn't use a real device. For practical reasons, it's hard to kind of manipulate what those devices say, but also we didn't want them to be stuck on a familiar device. So we introduced them to a new device. These were children ages 4 through 10. And they came into the lab, this was in person, and there was this little speaker thing on the table, and it would introduce itself.
Hi, my name is Ano.
So we gave it a fake name. We said, this is a new device. It can go on the internet and it can, listen to your questions and answer them. And then to compare that, because in many of our studies, we like to compare, it's not enough to say kids trust this device. We need to know, well, would they also trust a person, right? Would they trust an adult? So we also had on a computer screen a person on a video call. It really wasn't a video call. It was just recorded, but it looked realistic.
Hi, my name is Heather.
So she would also introduce herself, right? Everybody is kind of introduced, has a name. And then we asked the kids 3 different kinds of questions. We asked them about what I'm calling stable information. This is information that doesn't change from day to day, right? So what color is a Kiwano fruit? It's a real fruit, but it's not a thing most kids have ever heard of, so they don't know the answer, is one example. We asked them about transient information, so information that can change every day, right? Which state had the most rain yesterday? Well, today it might be one place, but tomorrow it could be something else. And then in this study, one of the other pieces is we asked them about personal information. So the student, usually one of my students who would be sitting with the child would say things like, what is my grandmother's name, right? So the child doesn't know this. And the question is, do you think the technology could tell you what my grandmother's name is, or what my favorite color is, or what sport I played in high school, right? That kind of personal information. So we did a few different variations of this research. Sometimes the person doing the experiment would ask the question of the device, and
A Kiwano fruit is yellow.
The device would answer, and then we asked the child, do you think that's right? Do you think that, the Kiwano fruit is yellow? We also did a version where they had to choose who would get it right. So we would say, what color is a Kiwano fruit? Do you think this device would get it, or do you think my friend Heather would know the answer better? And again, sometimes we ask them to explain why they chose it. So here's what we found. So these are children. This is showing you age, going from 4 up into age 9. And this is going with how often they said that the voice assistant, the technology, can answer the question. And what you see is these 2 lines, these are the facts. These are knowing what color the fruit is, knowing how much rain there was yesterday. And one thing you'll notice is that the 4-year-olds here, they're 50-50. They're not really sure what this thing can do or not do. And 50-50, that's just random. That's flipping a coin, right? Sometimes I pick the person, sometimes I don't. So they're really not sure. By the time they're 9, the kids are almost at 100% picking the technology, saying this is going to be better. And then what's also interesting is when it comes to these personal questions, right? Like, which one could tell you my grandmother's name? The little kids, the youngest kids in our study, actually think that technology can do that. They're not entirely wrong, maybe, right? Sometimes that information's out there. As kids get older, though, by the time they're 9, no child says that the device can tell you my grandmother's name. They think that's personal information. Technology doesn't have that. Again, not necessarily entirely true, right? Because you might be able to, find a website about my grandmother and tell me her name. When kids were asked why they chose the technology, the voice assistant, they mostly talked about information. So they would say things like it gets information from the internet and the weather station, and it can connect to it and get that information. They also sometimes said it has a very wide scope of knowledge. It can tell you anything that happened in America and even maybe in the world. That's a quote from a child. When they chose the person, they often said something about, remember she was introduced as my friend. Well, she's your friend. She would know your favorite color. Sometimes they also talked about people's brains, which is kind of nice to hear, right? Like, she can think about it. She has a brain. So again, the takeaway here is that young kids aren't actually that sure what new technologies can do. And they're actually kind of cautious about it, right? They're not just saying, I believe everything this device says. They're actually saying, maybe, maybe not. I like to talk about it in terms of it's the same way they treat strangers. So there's a lot of research showing that when children don't know somebody, they don't just automatically trust them, right? They want to see some evidence of like, you've given me some good answers. You've been nice to me. The adults I know you. You need some other pieces of evidence before you just go trusting someone new. Kids are treating technology very similarly up until about age 7 or 8. And then we start to see this, new sort of love of, going to the technology maybe over other people. In some of these studies, we also compare it to teachers instead of friends. And we also see around 7 or 8 years old, kids start to say, I think I'd rather go to Google than ask my teacher for better or worse. So kind of shifting gears now. So what can we do as adults, right? As people who care about children and interact with them. One big thing that adults, and this is something we've actually known back from the days of research on TV, is that adults need to do things together with children. So it's not enough that kids see adults, say, doing a Google search, getting out your phone and saying, I'm going to look up this information. You need to do it with them. This is called co-viewing. It used to be, again, with TV, right? The idea was you don't just put the child in front of the TV. You sit with them and you talk about it. And you say, oh, okay, so Google gave me all these search results. How will I decide which one I should click on, or which of these websites looks like a good website to get some reliable information, weather.com or something, you've never heard of before. Having those conversations with kids is really important, because even though it can seem like they know it, they'll tell you, oh, I've seen Google before. Yeah, I know what it does. When we kind of start really getting into depth, they don't always really understand it. So more specifically, another thing we can do is we need to just teach kids what kinds of things are on the internet, what kinds of information. There's a lot of emphasis on safety online and, not giving people personal information. And I think that's all really important. But there's a lot less talk about just modeling for kids how to use these technologies effectively. How does it work? There's not a tiny person inside my computer. It's connected to all these other computers. How does the information get there? Right. One thing that I want to do more research on is I don't think kids understand that people put the information on there. Right. But, you go to that website, that's somebody's opinion sometimes. It's not necessarily a indisputable fact. Another big one, of course, especially as kids get older, is how to recognize misinformation. So there's research, not from my lab, with 9 and 10-year-olds, where things that adults would say, oh, well, this is obviously not a good website. Like, it's got spelling errors. It's got things flashing all the time. It has ads. Kids are not good at recognizing those kinds of signals to the fact that, maybe you want to be careful about trusting, this site or this app. All right. So now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more in depth about what makes technology educational, right? Because, again, one of the things that we get at in my lab is the fact that I think it can be very educational. I think, my child has learned a lot. I've learned a lot from being able to look up information online. The kinds of things where when I was a child, I might have asked a question and the adults would have just said, I don't know. Now that doesn't happen nearly as much, right? I say, oh, hey, I don't know what the capital of Madagascar is, but we can look it up, right? I can tell you. Or, what was this old movie about? We talk a lot about old movies in my house right now. I haven't seen that movie. When I was a kid, it would have just been a shrug, but now we can find out. That said, I want to preface that not everything has to be educational. Sometimes things can just be fun, right? And it's okay, I think, to use technology sometimes just for fun. But if our goal is for technology to be used in an educational way, then there's things that we can do to kind of figure out what would be a good way to do that, or what's going to be effective. So these are 4 principles for what to look for in terms of educational technology. They were originally developed for apps. There was a research study where they looked at the 100 most popular apps for kids, on the App Store, and said, okay, how good are these? Are these actually educational? And what the researchers came up with is these 4 guidelines. So I'm going to walk you through each one. And on that handout, I also have them listed so that you can take this information with you. So the first guideline is that to be educational, the activity needs to be active. And I'm going to show you some examples from television, because this actually also applies to television, that hopefully are more familiar than some of these apps to a lot of adults. So active basically means your mind is on, right? You're making decisions. Even when you're doing something like watching television, children can be more or less actively involved. So some of the shows, classic shows that did this really well, like Mr. Rogers, right? He would face the camera. He would ask the question. And so, obviously the child wasn't there in the room with him, but it gave the child a chance to kind of think about things, right? And, what do you think will happen? Or what do you think I should say? Sesame Street also does this really well, right? It shows the child, it has lots of different things to say. Here's what you should pay attention to. Count along with me, right? As we count, right? And nice sort of repetition and things like that. Also, not a lot of distractions in these types of shows, right? There's like one clear thing happening at a time. In terms of technology and apps, there's a lot of nice examples of this. So one thing is to look for things where the child can make decisions. This is a screenshot of an app called Toca Boca World. Toca Boca in general is a company that makes, I think, really nice apps for kids. And one of the things that they do really well is you can do lots of different things in these apps. So in this one, you can move the people around, you can dress them up in different ways, you can, create a story, right? It has a lot of options, and the child is the one directing it, right? It's not, the opposite of this would be the child being told, okay, what you do is you drag this here and you drag this here, right? Like, that's not options. That's not real, thinking involved in that kind of app. So again, the first thing we want to look for is active. Minds on, thinking, manipulating things, making choices. The second piece is that it should be engaging. And engaging is a tricky one because it depends a lot on the child, right? You need it to not be too boring and not be too challenging. And it's really about also, being age appropriate. So these is, again, some examples of TV shows that do this really well. Maisie Mouse was one of my child's favorites. It's actually a very slow-paced show. Peg Plus Cat is another one designed to teach kids math concepts. And the thing about some of these TV shows is, again, for adults, they can be very kind of slow-moving, but they're just right for a toddler, right? They keep them engaged. There's not a lot of what you might call sort of cheap tricks of like things popping out to get your attention, things like that. That's actually a thing to really watch out for is, too much, right? Overload. A lot of the apps and games right now have these things where things pop up. You get the star here and this boat, It's a lot. It's better to have something that can kind of keep the child engaged without having to like reward them with, bells and whistles all the time. This is a fun app. It's currently, I think, one of the top apps. It's called Think Rolls. It has like puzzles, basically, that the child has to solve. And, it also shows a lot of cause and effect, right? So you want things that continue your attention, not, you do this, okay, now you just completely switch to something else, right? It keeps the child engaged. This is one that actually my son, who's in high school now, really loves, and this is just an example again of having it be age appropriate. So, when he was a child, he might have loved Think Rolls. It has this kind of puzzle solving, and that's a thing he enjoys. This one's called Monument Valley. It is challenging. I have played it. It's not easy, but it's really the same concept of you have to kind of figure out like how to make this path work so that, and it has like little levers and things like that. Again, the point being just, it needs to be at the right level to keep the child's attention. If it's too hard or if it's too easy, things are going to fall apart, even if it's, otherwise maybe an educational activity. The third principle is the activity needs to be meaningful. And this is a big one. It needs to connect to the child's other knowledge. It needs to connect to real life, right? How do you solve problems in the real world? Some of the shows that do this well, right? Shows that talk, for example, about family issues like Bluey and Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood do this well because they talk about things that are very relevant to young children, right? How do we solve this problem? It doesn't have to be human beings. It just has to be that the ideas can transfer to real things, right? In terms of apps, these are examples. Again, I'm only showing you examples of good apps. I don't want to show you the bad stuff. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. This one is called My Food Nutrition for Kids. And it's just about like picking different foods off a plate. But it also has a nice component of like checking off things that you've eaten and, to show another person. This is a nice example. So a lot of these apps, for example, you might say, well, here's a math app. And it has, adding numbers or dividing or multiplying. It's so much better if it has a connection to real life. So this is called Motion Math Pizza Party. I'm not sure it's still available. But instead of just adding numbers here, you're ordering at a pizza shop, right? And that's a real life skill. You might really go into a shop and want to order things and have to calculate, how much is it going to cost to have these slices of pizza? And so that's another thing to look for, is like that transfer to real life. This is another example. This one is a little funny. It's called Dr. Panda Restaurant Asia. And it's kind of silly looking. You make sushi rolls, right? So you take the little bits and you put them in the middle here and you make this. And I'm sharing this one because my son really enjoyed this when he was younger, when he was maybe 5 or 6 years old. And playing this game got him interested in trying sushi because he had never had it. But he had played this game and he had this the next time we went somewhere and there was sushi available, I said, this kind of got him into this idea of I could try this food, because I played this little game where we made the sushi. So that's another kind of way to connect things, right? Is, it doesn't always have to be, again, realistic what's happening in the game, but can it transfer to, hey, you made these new foods in the game. Maybe you want to try making a new food in real life at home one day. And then the last one is that ideally, technology should be used for interaction. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean you always have to have a person there. So some of the classic TV shows that did this really well, like Blue's Clues and Dora the Explorer, one of the things that made these shows so effective is that the characters would pause and then the child was kind of asked, oh, what do you think Dora should do next, right? And then there's the choices. If you've ever watched these, Blue's Clues also would turn to the camera, right, and say, what should I do? What color is it? In these cases, right, they weren't really having a social interaction, but in fact, research shows that kids will develop what are called a parasocial relationship, where they actually do feel like they're, even though we as adults might say, well, you're not really talking to Dora, kids actually really do kind of feel like they are, like they feel like this is a real interaction. Technology actually has some great opportunities for this, right? So anything where kids are doing something with a live human being on the other end. So there's apps, for example, for reading books, say with a grandparent who might be somewhere else, but, can be on the screen and you can look at the book together, or games that you can play together. Also games that they can play with other children. Ideally, games that involve, taking turns, having more than one person, making choices. I always tell my child, if at all possible, my kid likes to play video games. I would much rather have the kids he's playing with be in the room. Like I'd like him to, invite them to our house and sit in the room with them as opposed to being online. But he connects to cousins who live in other states. Sometimes, they get on and ideally also, Again, there's safety issues here, so I don't let my child, for example, play with kids he does not actually know in real life, right? So the only friends he has in these games are kids we know. Ideally, I also prefer that he play games where you actually do get to talk out loud, because sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're just kind of seeing them on the screen. But in some games, and sometimes when they don't have that, he calls them and we puts it on speakerphone and they play together, and are talking. The more you can have of that real life social interaction. One game that does this also real well and is very popular is Minecraft, right? Minecraft offers opportunities for collaboration with other people. Also some nice stuff about, building and creativity and things like that. So again, just to recap, what to look for, we want it to be active, engaging, meaningful, and social and socially interactive. Some things to look out for, some things to avoid. Just too much stuff, right? Some of these games, you open them and there's just so many bells and whistles. There's so many different things, right? It's a lot. It can be a lot for adults, and it certainly is a lot sometimes for young kids. Like, even if the intention is that it's going to be educational, I would stay away with things with, too many sounds, too many flashing lights, just too much. Also, some of these apps are very repetitive. You just do the same thing over and over. That is not ideal for children's learning, right? We want kids to have a variety of experiences. I'm also very wary of games that I call like tappers, things where you just go tap, 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 tap on the screen, right? Without having to really think about anything. I would much rather see my child playing games where, you have to think about your next step and then you tap on the screen. Another one to watch out for is games where success is random. This is not good for adults either, right? This is the kind of thing that sometimes gets people addicted to things, is when you don't know what's going to happen, right? It's like playing the lottery. Okay, sometimes I press it and I win, and sometimes I press it and I lose, and there's no real rhyme or reason. Not great. We want kids to be doing things where they can clearly see, I solved this puzzle. This was the consequence, not I randomly, got to beat this game. And then another one to look out for is just things that are constantly changing, like between one activity to the other. Look out for apps that are trying to do too much. We're doing math and we're doing reading and we're doing letters and, I'm skeptical of things like that. Much better to pick an app that, math, great. We're going to focus on math. This is also true for TV shows. There's some research suggesting that kids shows that have very quick scene cuts. SpongeBob SquarePants is famously one of these, where it's like, you see this and then this happens and this, it's like very fast pace. That seems to potentially be damaging to children's attention to kind of get into that habit. So what else can we as adults do to help support kids get into good habits? Again, I don't believe in saying no screens ever. I don't think that's realistic, frankly, these days. I think what we really need to do is we need to teach kids how to manage their time on screens, how to use technology safely. And by the way, the American Academy of Pediatrics also has backed off of this lately. So they used to have this like no screen time below age 2, 1 hour. And you'll notice now they've kind of backed away from that to trying to be a little more inclusive and to really say, well, it kind of matters more what you're doing than just the sheer number of minutes. So this is kind of one of what I hope will be a big takeaway is when it comes to kids and technology, quality is really much more important than quantity. I put the link in that handout to a piece earlier this year in Time magazine by a psychologist named Kendra Thomas, who I thought wrote a really brilliant piece talking about it in terms of like the way we used to talk about calories, right? So you might say, okay, a healthy number of calories for children every day is 1,500 calories. That's really not true, right? Just focusing on the calories is not good, because if the calories are all candy, you would say, well, that's not going to be a very healthy child. Even if they're staying in the calorie count, they're only eating junk food, right? What we care about is what are they eating? Maybe it's okay to go a little over if what they're eating is healthy, fruits and vegetables, right? And so I think that's a really good analogy to screen time, which is it's not really about counting the minutes, within reason, of course. We don't want kids, doing this all day long. But it's also about, what are you doing? Are you on a FaceTime call with your grandma? That's not the same as I'm just watching, YouTube videos of kids playing video games, right? You have to really think about what's being done. So like I said, the AAP, the American Association of Pediatrics, or Academy of Pediatrics, has really backed off of this. And their new thing is what they're calling the 5 C's. So this is their new sort of guidelines for parents of children across the entire age range from, birth to high school. And so I wanted to tell you about these new 5 C's, because these are relatively new to me too, that they've developed these. So I'm going to walk you through each of these one by one, and I've also listed them on that handout. So the first C is child. You need to think about who are we talking about, right? The rules for a 3-year-old are not the same as for a 13-year-old, right? And the things that would be appropriate to them are not going to be the same. So we have to think about their age, but you also really need to think about their personality. What kinds of things is this child going to be scared by potentially online? Like how closely do I need to watch out? How good are they at, controlling themselves and stopping when they need to, take a break? That's going to depend a lot on the kid. That's not just about age. But also things like their interests, right? I've told you about my son. He really enjoyed things like puzzles. So I tried to find things with puzzles. He also really enjoyed geography. So we had a lot of little apps with, countries and things like that. Other kids probably wouldn't have enjoyed those things, right? So you need to think about that. And, what motivates them? Like, what kinds of things are they going to enjoy? Do they, need to be interacting with other kids to really enjoy it? So that's the child. The next one is the content, which we've already talked a lot about. What is this child doing or watching, right? What YouTube videos are they watching? Are they age appropriate? If the goal is to be educational, would you say they're educational, or is it just, the title of the video, educational, right? And that's not enough. Another big one, which we don't really have time to get into today, is ads. So there's been a good amount of research showing that, in general, young kids don't understand what's an advertisement, right? Like, oh, they're trying to get you to buy this thing or to go to this site, that, it's trying to persuade you. Again, things like, is it scary? Is it violent? And I would just say more in general, does it align with your values? Does it teach things, like kindness, or, appreciation of other cultures? What are the things that your family cares about that you want these, the media to teach? The third C is, it's a little funny. It's not really about technology. So it's calm. One of the big worries is that families are sometimes using technology to keep kids calm or to get them to be calm. Like, a kid is upset. I've seen this myself. You hand them the phone. Okay, watch this video. That's problematic because we, as adults, we need to be able to regulate our own emotions, right? We've all, as adults, learned how to calm ourselves down, how to, fall asleep at night. And so the big question here is, how well can the child calm down? And are they using technology to do this? Also, are they using screens before bedtime? And of course, the AAP's answer here is we should be avoiding this. This is not when you want to be using screens. Kids need to learn to calm down on their own, or learn techniques like taking deep breaths, right? Things that you can do without technology. The fourth C is crowding out. And again, I think this is another important worry, which isn't, it's not so much about what you're doing on the technology, it's what you're not doing because you're on a screen, right? So, our kids skipping opportunities to socialize and play with other kids? Are they skipping opportunities to exercise or eat or sleep to be on a screen? That's when we start to worry, right? That's when you start to say, okay, yeah, maybe you need to put some limits in because it's important for children to have other types of experiences. And then finally, the last C is communication. And this is kind of throwing back to some of the things I talked about earlier, which is, what are we actually telling kids about technology, right? Part of this is, what are we modeling? Like, what do the adults do, right? Are the adults looking at their phone while they're eating dinner and, not listening to you? And this is an issue that researchers have started to really look at, techno distraction, basically. Are adults talking about, what did you see on YouTube? What are you watching? And then the sort of broader level here is having conversations with kids, even young kids, about what the rules are. In our family, you can do this, but, these kinds of things are not allowed on technology, right? You can't go on the App Store and buy the apps without running it by me first, or download new things, right? That could be a rule families have. So this last one, communication, I just wanted to leave you with some suggestions because, again, this, I think, is a really important one for, this is true in families, but this can also be true in classrooms, right? Also kind of laying out, well, okay, what are our guidelines? What do we care about? And I think each family has to decide this on their own. So there's a lot of different sites online, too, where you can find family screen time or technology plans, right? And a lot of this is really for the adults, right? It's really not about the kids. It's the adults kind of deciding, okay, what is the goal of our using technology? Are there going to be places in our house that we're going to say are screen-free? So like in my house, when we eat meals together, we don't look at our phones, right? Because again, the research shows that is a real distraction to having conversations. And my child knows that. He would never bring his phone to the table because he knows we just don't do that, right? Now, again, you have to be consistent here, right? You can't say you don't bring your phone, but I bring my phone to the table. How are you going to enforce this, right? How are you going to make sure these rules are followed? Do you need to be watching your child, and what kinds of things do you do together, or what kinds of things can they do on their own? Do you need to monitor them? Who's going to decide which apps or shows your child can watch? And then number 6, I think, is also an important one, which is how are you going to communicate your rules to the other people in that child's life, right? So, we have these issues in my family, which is when my child goes to visit his grandparents and his cousins are there, and all the video games come out for hours, right? And, you kind of have to negotiate, well, okay, his cousins have different rules. And, how are we going to work that out? And what kinds of guidelines are we going to set? And I think, we don't have these conversations, even between adults, very much, unfortunately, right? We don't really talk, even in my family, about, okay, well, our rules are, he can only watch 30 minutes of this show, not 2 hours of it. How will we negotiate that? There's a really great site, if this is something that, speaks to you and you want to do it in your home. The AAP has started, and I just tried this out yesterday. They have a website that walks you through this whole process. And one of the really nice things about it is that you can enter the child's age, and say you have a family with 3 children, you can put all their ages, and you can say, what are your priorities, right? So, one of my priorities is I want my child not to be on screens too much. I want them to also, exercise and do other things. Okay, and then it gives you really nice tips. It's really a nice website that they've put together. And you can even save it. You can print it. You can share it with other people. Again, I've put the link in that handout. But the other nice thing about this is when you save it and your child gets older, you can come back and you can change it. You can say, okay, well, now they're 5. What are the new guidelines? They're also encouraging pediatricians to give out this information. So again, I really like what they're doing, which is that they're backing off of being so like, oh, no screen time ever, to saying, okay, what are the things that we can do to help kids use, technology in healthy kind of ways. And so that kind of brings me to my last point, which is that I feel like one thing I want to acknowledge is that parenting is hard, and caring for children is hard. And some of you might have seen the Surgeon General came out with a statement earlier this year. I think it was in July. This is the cover of the report that the Surgeon General came out with, basically saying, parents are under a lot of stress. And I think technology is a big source of this, right? A lot of parents, this is one survey, say that technology is making caring for children more difficult, right? There's just so many decisions. And social media, by the way, also kind of is being thrown in there. And so I think, one thing to keep in mind is it doesn't have to be perfect. And, my child, sometimes you've got a lot of work to do or something's going on and you just have to sit them down with the iPad and it's okay, right? That's not going to, I really do worry. There's a lot of fear about like technology affecting children's brains and I think some of it is justified, but also we have to kind of give people a little bit of grace and understand that, like, just like with the radio, right? Like, there's always going to be some fears and it might not always be kind of as bad as we fear it's going to be. And so, my closing words here are just, if you're here already and you're listening to me today, you've got this. Don't, take a deep breath, and it's not as, I think, as scary sometimes as we make it out to be. I think, with some good choices and good knowledge, I think adults can help kids cope with this. So that's it for today, but I did want to put in one more thing, and then I'm happy to take questions, which is, if you found any of this interesting and you know any children, you have children, or you know children here in Louisville, but also now we do research online, so they don't necessarily have to live in Louisville. I put these little yellow postcards by the door. My lab at U of L is always looking for children ages 3 through 12 who might want to be in studies. You've seen examples of the kinds of things that we ask them about, we don't ask personal questions. We don't ask about mental health. We're asking mostly about, thinking and using technology for information. If you know anyone who's interested, they can go to our website. They can also call that number or email and sign up. There's no obligation to participate. If you sign up, what my students at U of L will do is one day they might email you or call you and say, oh, hey, you said you have this child. Would you like to be in a study? And you can always just say no. The kids do get prizes, and the online participants get Amazon gift cards. So there's an incentive for them. And the kids actually, they really like these studies. They usually have a good time. They like, adults getting to ask them questions, and they get to tell us just what they think. There's no right or wrong answers. So again, if you know anyone or if you want to spread the word, I would love to have some of your connections sign up. The website is louisvillekidstudies.org. And that is it, but I'd be happy to answer questions or talk or hear about your experiences too. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. This was really insightful, helpful.
Thanks.
I'm also thinking, as more and more websites are starting to require things like logins, and data mining is getting more and more prevalent, do you have any recommendations about talking to kids about internet safety, or do you have guidelines in your house about whether and when you share an email address with the site? Or
we're very strict about this because we've tried to drive home once you put it on the internet, it's there forever, right? Like you give someone your email address, you give someone your phone number, right? Good luck getting it back. By the way, there's some interesting legislation, which I didn't get into, that is kind of gaining traction. It actually already passed in the UK, and I think maybe in other parts of Europe, where so right now, a lot of websites just say, are you age 13 and up? And all you have to do is say yes. But they're actually starting to require the companies, like, say, for Instagram. Right, Instagram is one of these sites. This is the push. It hasn't passed yet. But I think it actually might stand a chance, where the companies are going to have to be much more careful, specifically about privacy, right? So also things like in the UK now, if the site is for kids, the defaults have to be like the most privacy. We don't have that yet in the US, but I think, again, it's promising from what I understand that the government might actually pass some of these rules here too. So in terms of internet safety, in our house, the number one rule is we do not interact with someone we don't actually know in real life. That's always been the rule for my kid, right? I will tell you, my child is also not on social media. Social media, like I said, is it's a whole other thing, right? Because there's a lot of I know this person because they go to my school, but I don't really know them very well, right? And I think a lot more danger, frankly, for kids when it comes to social media. In terms of private information, I tell my kid not to share it, but sometimes there is a site where you have to set up an account. Now that he's 14, he does have his own Gmail account, but we also have the passwords to it, and we try, it's tricky because there's a balance here, right? I want him to be able to manage this stuff on his own, because in a few years, I'm not going to be there to tell him, don't put your credit card in that site, be careful. But I think, again, this depends a lot on the kid, but with him, so we have access to his email account, but we don't look at it every day. We don't read the messages from his friends, but he knows that if we were worried, we might, right? And again, that's what works for our family, but that's not necessarily what's going to work for everybody else. Again, there are really good sites. I want to say, I listed a couple of the sites that I really like. There's the Harvard Center for Digital Thriving I put on this list. They have some nice tools for older kids and teens. Also, Technosapiens, she, the woman who who writes that site. She is a clinical psychologist who does this research, and so I find her stuff is really well researched. And so I gave you a link to. She has a guide to like teens and phones and mental health, which are some things I didn't really get into today. I hope that's helpful. It's tricky. It really is tricky. Yeah.
Is there anyone who has rated different apps on educational values so we don't have to reinvent the wheel?
So they don't all follow those same 4 principles. That was a particular research study that was done in like 2021. But Common Sense Media, I think, is pretty good for this. I discovered recently that they want you to create an account and they only let you look at like 3 reviews for free, but they're good. I mean, I look at them also for movies, for TV show, they cover all kinds of media, but one of the things they cover is apps and games, like video games. And I think they're pretty good. They'll tell you, is this very educational? Does it have things that could be problematic, like violence, right? Like with video games and things like that. So that's my pick. I think, yeah, they're probably the best one for apps. They do. Yeah, they don't have a ton, but they have some. Yes.
Are you seeing in education? Oh, sorry. What trends are you seeing in education, or would like to see in education, with the highly accessible information to kids now? Like my son will not do arithmetic anymore because he will ask Alexa, every time at home anyway. And that concerns me. So, and then also like with information accuracy being a key point for children to be learning, are you seeing anything in our education system that's adjusting to those requirements?
Yeah, so in terms of classrooms, I mean, it really varies from school to school. There are actual guidelines for teaching kids. They say things like by 4th grade, kids should have, done, like, used internet searches and talked about what makes a good site. I can't say that I haven't observed that schools are doing this consistently. I think some school districts are doing it, some aren't. It's kind of all over the place, right? There's also classrooms that have devices like this in them. I haven't seen this myself, but I've read reports, right? So there are teachers who've gotten an Alexa and put it in the classroom and encourage the kids. And again, I could see pros and cons there, because if the teacher's talking to them about, even yesterday we had an incident in my house where kids don't always know what kinds of questions to ask Alexa. Sometimes they ask things that I'm like, but that it can't really answer that, like subjective questions, right? Like, what's the best ice cream flavor? Well, that's an opinion. That's not, so talking about things like, well, what's a fact and what's an opinion? And, okay, well, these devices can answer some facts. They're not always perfect, right? Sometimes they get it wrong. What kinds of things are they more likely to get wrong? So, there are guidelines out there. I haven't seen people like classrooms doing them consistently. I assume that there are some teachers out there that are doing it, but it would be nice to see more of it and for it to be. And the other thing is, a lot of it has, at least historically, started later, which is like this safety, social media, online, don't give out your password and your address, right? But I think we also need to be talking about more basic things like, where do you get the answer to a question? That's what my research is really driving at is, okay, well, kids actually do need some advice on this. This is not a thing that they can just kind of pick up necessarily on their own. Yes. Oh, sorry. Whoever has the mic, I guess.
Yes. Well, first I want to say thank you, because you're leaving at least me with a sense of hope and not dread, like, this all going to hell. Excuse me.
I'm glad. That really makes me happy to hear, because I think technology has a lot of good things. It's not all bad.
So one thing, even though we're not talking about social media, because you mentioned the Surgeon General, and recently he's also said this about social media, that there should be a disclaimer, like for smoking, for example,
yes.
for the effects on mental health. And then what caught my attention was your child being 14 and not on social media. That is a rarity.
Yeah.
And, on family plan, point number 6, like your family plan can fall apart very quickly. There is, my daughter is 12 and she's not on social media, but I can count on one hand her friends who are not. So
well, and there's a gender difference too. A lot more girls are on social media than boys. So
do you
that's
have
part
any
of it.
suggestions to, this is a constant question in my mind, that the peer pressure will come up.
It's a tough one. It's really tough. And if you haven't read The Anxious Generation, that's one of the things that he goes into a lot of depth about in that book, particularly girls, like tween age girls, right? 12, 13, 14-year-old girls, and all the like sort of peer pressure to be on social media. And honestly, it is a tough one. I feel lucky that my son just isn't that interested in it. But I was asking him just the other day, okay, in your class, how many people are on social media? And he said, oh, no, pretty much everybody but me. He just doesn't care. But I think probably the most important thing is still the communication, honestly, right? Which is, I don't know if you can avoid it forever, but like I said, having like co-viewing, right? Saying, okay, well, show me what you're looking at on Instagram. If you decide that your child should have an Instagram account, right? Who are you connected to, right? I mean, that's what I would do personally, is I would want, and talk about it, because, one of the big dangers, one of the Surgeon General's warnings is some of the advertisements, right? It's not really necessarily just about the other kids, saying things about you or posting pictures of themselves. It's about the algorithm pitches things, especially to teenage girls, right? Things that promote, for example, unhealthy eating habits and weight loss and things like that, right? And so to me, that would be a thing that I would want to talk about up front and say, well, so I've gotten these as an adult who doesn't look for weight loss systems, right? Like, I think it just knows that I am a female, middle-aged person, and it says, oh, I'm going to pitch weight loss to you, right? And I've never clicked on any of those, but it still does it. But I understand, right? I know, okay, this algorithm has looked at my location and my demographics. Kids don't necessarily understand that. And I just recently heard a podcast with some researchers talking about how that can be really empowering for kids, for teens, to say, they're trying to manipulate you, right? Like, Instagram, it's not just giving you the things you want to see. It's trying to sell you things. It's trying to, convince you to act in certain ways, which, teens don't like that. They don't like to, they want to say, oh, no, you can't manipulate, you can't make me do this, right? And so some researchers are showing that, it might actually be empowering for kids to say, okay, let's teach you. You see what's happening here? You see, you click like on this and see how now you got all these ads? So that might be something to think about at the point where you feel like, okay, we're going to, allow this child to have it. Is, I think, as adults, our role isn't to just say, no, you can never do this, but to say, okay, can we teach you ways to do this that will keep you from harm, that will be healthy? There is some research saying, like, for some teens who are socially isolated, the internet can be really great, right? Sometimes they can find communities that they feel like they belong in that they don't have in their home or in their school. So it's not always all bad. It's just a question of, can you find the good things, and can you teach kids to avoid the dangerous things?
Are you aware of any current research findings on the effects of screen time and the frontal lobe development?
Well, so there's research on executive function. So, look, let's be straight. There's a lot of speculation. There's really not a ton of research with younger kids. There's research sometimes with teens, but frontal lobe development starts very young, and I would say most of the research so frontal lobes is this front part of your brain, and it's tied to executive functions, which is things like having self-control, being able to plan, being able to, have patience to reach a goal, right? Those are the kinds of things we talk about with executive functions. There's worries, right? I haven't seen research directly looking at brain activity or brain development. But, there's a worry that, for example, these activities like apps and games where everything is constantly flipping and there's all these like kind of random rewards, those are definitely not building up that executive function, right? Executive function would be, okay, I have to be patient. I have to complete all these steps and then I get the prize at the end, right? And so I think there's good reasons to worry that it could be affecting frontal lobe development. I haven't seen, definitive research, but the other thing we were talking about this before the session is this technology is changing so fast that it's hard for researchers to keep up, right? Like I'm doing this research on voice assistants, but now AI is the new thing, right? And people sometimes ask me, well, are you researching AI? And it's like, well, I haven't even answered yet what kids think about Google, right? Like, I mean, but it's a real problem. Like it's changing so quickly. There was research on TV, but TV had been around for decades, right? It took a lot of time to get all that research on, okay, how does TV affect kids? This stuff really is, if you think about like smartphones and social media, they haven't been around more than like 12 years, 14 years max, right? So, research is slow. That's why I'm asking you all to bring me your children, because like it takes a long time. It takes us, each of these studies takes several years to do. By the time we finish a study, the technology has changed. Some of the questions that we asked the children, can Alexa answer these? At the time, it couldn't, but the technology keeps getting better, right? And it can. Or sometimes now, instead of saying, I don't, for like a subjective question, Alexa will say, well, I can't answer that question and give like an explanation. It didn't used to do that. So it's very tricky to keep up, and it's just going to get better, right? Like the next step is going to be, it's going to get even more conversational. It's going to be, one of the things also, the early devices were not good at understanding children's speech, right? Because kids sometimes mispronounce things, and their the pitch of their voice is different, and so if you watch like older videos of kids talking to Alexa, it's often just them getting frustrated because the thing does not understand what they're saying. But that's getting better too, right? It's getting better at understanding, young children, people with accents, right? All kinds of things that it couldn't do before. So again, it's just a constant race that I feel like I'm never going to finish, but we're working on it. Well, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it.